Hello there friends, I hope you're surviving well and welcome back to episode 6 of
Concept Limbo,
the series where I ask such vital questions as, is running with chainsaws really that dangerous? And how many Newmans does it take to change the oil in a light bulb? So far in my journey through the rusty annals of time, I've managed to dig up enough dormant concepts to make 2 or 3 other survival games, and in the episode before this one, I delved into the greasy recesses of Gary Newman's brain to see what his overall vision for Rust was. Now though, events are about to take a shocking turn as we focus our attention on the subject of electricity in the game. You see, there was quite a buzz around the spring and summer of 2015 after the concept was discussed in a number of dev blogs, but as soon as everyone had been worked up into a froth about it, the power was suddenly cut on the idea and we've been in the dark ever since. In this episode though, we're going to recap on what the excitement was all about and more importantly, what on earth happened to the concept. So grab a defibrillator and apply liberal amounts of conductive gel as we investigate whether there's still a spark of life in the idea. The earliest reference I could find to electricity in Rust was way back on the 11th of July 2014, where artist Megan Tupper posted these fuel-powered generator concepts to the Trello boards. In keeping with the feel of Rust, they all look makeshift and grungy, and the idea generated quite a bit of interest, but as the reboot was at a very early stage at this point, this was an isolated concept that didn't lead to anything more serious, until, almost 8 months later to the day, Howie at Facepunch flicked the switch on again and started exploring a few more ideas for generating power, this time swapping fuel for wind. As he explained, first way would be as simple as placing it within the existing building pieces. If windmills have tiers and or weight, the underlying structure would need to support it. Another way is just to have a pre-made model for the player to place on an open spot on the ground. Gives us more control of how it's designed, so it always looks good but takes away some flexibility and creativity from the player, and bases might start to look repetitive since everyone will be using the same windmill model. And last, similar to the first method, except there'd be specific scaffolding building pieces players would use when constructing functional architecture like the windmill. The scaffolding signifies a functional piece of architecture and creates an interesting silhouette. Scaffolding could also be upgraded to support higher tier windmills. Things went quiet again until a month or so later when Megan showed us some designs for interior lighting that she'd been working on and explained that she'd
first tried out a few that would involve candles and fire, but what we're looking at now are lights that run off electricity and things that you can hang from walls and ceilings. I thought that you could paint some bulbs to change colour too.
It's interesting to note that she said we're looking at, and in fact it does seem that the team in general were thinking along the lines of adding electricity at this point, an assumption that's reinforced by an answer Gary gave to a rather good question that was fired at him on Ask FM on May the 1st.
If you could add 3 things to Rust right now, instantly without any effort, what would you add?
And he replied,
200 FPS, electricity and farming.
I mean, of course, harvesting pumpkins at night under powerful floodlights with incredibly high frames would be the ultimate survival experience, it's no secret, but in all seriousness, this is revealing of what Gary was thinking at the time. A lot of things started happening in quick succession at this point, with at least 3 members of the dev team working on electrical goods. Over the next fortnight, Megan continued with her plans for lighting and even threw up some concepts for wiring and how it could be laid out on the walls of bases. Howie then modelled some of his freestanding windmill concepts in 3D, as this was the idea that was decided on, and chose number 3 as the final design because it looked iconic from a distance and had the right rusty aesthetic. The Megan Tupper design wagon was unstoppable at this point, and she not only came up with an idea for the bin lid ceiling light that we now know so well, but also for a scrap searchlight for shining on loitering nakeds at night. Vince was really quick to turn this into a reality the following week, but the fact that we can't play with this yet makes me sad. Just look at it, it's glorious! Howie then finalised the windmill, passed it over to Vince for modelling, and announced that the next project he was going to work on was engines, not just fuel powered, but steam and coal as well. In the following dev blog, number 63, Vince had finished the ceiling light model, and the week after, Howie did indeed have some engines to show us, although sadly this was pretty much the last that was ever heard of them as separate items. Finally, in devblog 65 on 18th of June, Vince unveiled the finished windmill model, and this is what he had to say about it. It will soon come to you when our electricity update hits. And here it is in action. It was never fully implemented, but reassuringly it's still a deployable nearly a year later, albeit one that can only be spawned in with a plugin. After this flurry of activity, and amidst talk of an imminent electricity update however, everything suddenly went quiet. Howie went on to work on vehicle designs, Vince moved on to the dungeons, and Megan, well, as far as I can tell, she stopped working for Facepunch a couple of months or so after this, at least as far as Rust was concerned. Anyway, a month later in Devblog 68, Howie said something interesting as after vehicles, which I took a good look at in episode 2 of this series, he went on to draw up a design for a large fractioning tower. This is basically the mother of all refineries with a carbon footprint a mile wide and big enough to be used as a lookout post if you wanted. He said, "It'll allow players to turn crude oil into different types of fuel. The fuel will eventually be used to power different types of engines and vehicles, which will in turn give the pump jack more of a purpose." It got modelled by Vince a month later, but exactly what fuels it would produce and how they were going to be used was yet to be decided by Helk, so it was mothballed along with everything else. I get the feeling that maybe they started getting ahead of themselves at this point and decided to rein things back in until other more fundamental aspects of the game were ironed out. Interestingly, the very same day, Gary was asked how high in the list the electricity update was, to which he replied,
"It links into a lot of stuff we want to do, so it'll come relatively soon in some small form."
There's that word soon again. Well, it didn't, but over the next 3 months he continued to answer questions about it on Ask FM as if it was still very much on his frontal lobe. For instance, he revealed that electricity would be used to power not just lights but communications, doors and lifts, that the plan was to have an energy source feeding into energy storage and then that distributing to devices within a radius. Also that if someone was able to build close enough they could potentially pilfer your energy. On September the 1st, a community suggestion for electric signage was featured, which would be a step up from the basic stuff visible at night and ideal for kebab shops. And then, at the end of the year, Gary gave us his review of 2015, laying out his plans for Rust to leave early access. This involved giving us an actual roadmap this time, which we're already way behind on coincidentally, but curiously, it gave no mention whatsoever of electricity. And when quizzed about this 2 months later in February, he replied that it was now a post-early access thing. So what had happened? What caused it to go from being a feature that was about to be implemented in mid-2015 to something that wasn't going to happen until after early access? It's hard to say really, because I just don't have access to the decision-making process at Facepunch Studios. It's clear from what Gary said in his end-of-year review though that heads had been put together at some point and it was decided that Rust development needed a more structured approach. I think it's appropriate to give a pie-based analogy at this point. It's no good adding the fillings until you've made the pastry, otherwise you just get gravy and ingredients all over your hooves and it doesn't taste as good. I think basically it was decided that electricity was more of a filling than pastry, and now I feel hungry. That's not the end of the story, however, because surprisingly, out of the blue, that scrap ceiling light we saw earlier got added into the game in March this year, and even though it's somehow powered by low-grade fuel, to all intents and purposes it looks electric and should be electric when the time comes. This and the as yet unusable windmill are a pretty good indication, if you ask me, that we will get it at some point. One last thing that I noticed, and that was only just in time to make this episode, was a reply that Helk, who has the helm at Facepunch right now while Gary is on paternity leave, made to a post on Reddit on 26th of May entitled, "Is electricity getting any love by developers lately?" All he said was, XP first. Read into this what you will. Does this mean the plan has changed again and it'll make an appearance before Rust leaves early access but after we get the XP system? Who knows? But whenever it does happen, it's likely to do for Rust what Redstone did for Minecraft, i.e. allow people to make giant N64 emulators on their bases and completely jam up the server. Please leave me one of your ever insightful comments down below and let me know what you think of all of this. Thanks for liking and subscribing, and I'll catch you all in episode 7, but in the meantime, stay rusty. Cheerio.